Chapter 5. Keeping Fit. Clenching his paw as tightly as he could possibly manage, Paddington slowly raised his right arm until it was level with his shoulder. Then he bent it at the elbow until the paw itself was only a couple of centimetres or so away from the top of his head. Breathing heavily under the strain, he held the pose for several moments while he peered hopefully at his reflection in the bedroom mirror. But apart from a few slight trembles, there really wasn't much to see, and as the glass began to steam up, he let out his breath and relaxed again. Mopping his brow with the end of the counterpane, he collapsed onto his bed and gazed disconsolately at a large pamphlet spread out in front of him. It was full of brightly coloured pictures, most of which showed a day in the life of a gentleman called Grant Stalwart. Mr. Stalwart, who seemed to spend most of his time dressed only in a pair of mauve tights, was shown in a variety of poses, a number of which were not unlike the one Paddington had just attempted. However, looking at the pamphlet did nothing to dispel Paddington's feeling of gloom. In fact, the more he studied it, the more downcast he became. If the picture was anything to go by, Grant Stalwart was able to do the most extraordinary things with his muscles. Bags of cement, iron bars, nothing was too heavy for him to lift, or too strong for him to bend into. One picture even showed him standing alongside a gaily decorated Christmas tree, surrounded by a crowd of onlookers in paper hats, who watched admiringly as he cracked some after-dinner nuts for them between his biceps. Having fur didn't exactly help matters, but looking at his own arms, Paddington had to admit he couldn't see any muscles large enough to dent a soft-boiled egg, let alone crack walnut shells. It was almost disappointing, and after one more glance at the pamphlet, he bent down and began to open a large cardboard box. The box was labelled Grant Stalwart's World-Famous Home Bodybuilding Outfit, and on the lid was yet another picture of Mr. Stalwart himself. Paddington's interest in the subject had begun soon after his visit to the seaside. While at Brightsea, he'd noticed some lifeguards doing their exercises on the beach, and at the time he'd been most impressed by the things they were able to do. Then shortly afterwards, he'd come across an article in one of Mrs. Brown's magazines about the dangers of taking oneself for granted, and his interest had been aroused again. After reading Mrs. Brown's article, he'd spent several mornings doing press-ups on the bathroom floor, carefully testing himself on the scales both before and after. But either there was something very wrong with the scales at number 32 Windsor Gardens, or the marmalade sandwiches he'd eaten afterwards in order to restore his energy had more than made up for any lost weight. For if anything, the needle had gone up slightly each day rather than down. It was when he'd been glancing through the magazine again, in the hope of seeing where he might have gone wrong, that he'd come across Grant Stalwart's advertisement. Not even his worst enemy could have accused Grant Stalwart of taking his body for granted, and the advertisement was ringed with pictures of cups and medals he'd won in nearly every country in the world. According to Mr. Stalwart, the apparatus which had turned him into such a strong man was worth £30 of anybody's money, but notwithstanding that, he seemed more than eager to share the secret of his success with anyone who cared to write in, provided they enclosed a £5 note. However, the thing which really clinched matters for Paddington was the solemn promise to any of his customers that if by the end of the first week they weren't filled to the brim with boundless energy, he would refund their money without question. There was a lot more in small print at the bottom of the advertisement, but Paddington didn't bother to read it. Instead, he turned his attention to a section marked Testimonials from Satisfied Customers. Although none of them seemed to be from bears, it still struck him as a very good bargain indeed, and he lost no time in completing his application form and sending it in. But far from being filled with boundless energy, Paddington felt so worn out after his exercises, it was as much as he could do to read through the instructions again, let alone ask for a refund. The apparatus consisted of 2 tightly coiled springs, which were attached at one end to a large metal plate. Each spring had a wooden handle at its opposite end, and the plate itself came ready drilled with 4 holes and some special non-slip screws, so it could be fixed to a convenient wall. There were a lot of walls at number 32 Windsor Gardens, all of which looked only too convenient by Mr. Stalwart's standards, but somehow Paddington couldn't picture the Brown family being very enthusiastic about having any springs screwed to them. He tried jamming the plate between the bed rails, but after pulling the bed around the room several times without the springs giving so much as a creak, let alone showing any signs of expanding, he gave up in disgust and decided to try his luck in the garden. A few moments later, he hurried outside, armed with Mr. Brown's bag of tools, and was soon hard at work screwing the plate to a part of the fence that was safely hidden from the house by the garden shed. After testing it several times, in order to make sure it was firmly fixed, Paddington consulted its instructions again. Mr. Stalwart seemed to have no trouble at all with his apparatus. Muscles rippling, his tanned body gleaming, he scarcely batted an eyelid as he extended the springs to almost double their normal length. But however hard Paddington tried, he couldn't manage to pull his own springs apart by more than a centimetre or two, and when he did let go for a quick breather, they shot back, catching his fur in his spirals and pinning him to the fence. After a short rest, Paddington decided to have one more go. He freed himself from the springs and then gathered some spare stones from Mr. Brown's rockery and placed them in a row along the ground so that he would have a good foothold. This time he had much more success. After he had gone beyond a certain point, it became easier, and he was just glancing around to see if there were any more stones when he nearly jumped out of his skin as a loud cry rang out. "Bear! What are you doing to my fence, Bear?" Paddington wasn't at all sure what happened next, but in his fright he let go of the springs, and as he toppled over, he heard a loud crash from somewhere behind him. When he picked himself up and looked around, he saw to his horror that Mr. Curry was dancing up and down on the other side of the fence, clutching his nose. Ever since the unfortunate incident with the vacuum cleaner, Paddington had managed to avoid meeting Mr. Curry. In fact, had he been asked to produce a short list of the people he least wanted to see, Mr. Curry's name would have occupied the first 3 places. Anxious to make amends, Paddington hurried across the garden and peered over the top of the fence at the Brown's neighbour. "Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Curry," he exclaimed. "I didn't know you were poking your nose into my business." Mrs. Bird was always going on about Mr. Curry and the way he poked his nose into other people's affairs. But as soon as the words had left his mouth, Paddington realised he had said the wrong thing. He held up the springs. "I was only testing my new bodybuilder, Mr. Curry," he exclaimed. "If I'd known you were there, I would have waited until you'd gone. Perhaps you would like to have a go," he added hopefully, picking up Mr. Stalwart's brochure and opening it at a page where a particularly skinny-looking man was shown struggling with a dumbbell. "It's meant for 7 stone weaklings. There's a letter here from one just like you."
"What?"
Mr. Curry grew purple in the face.
"Are you calling me a 7 stone weakling, Bear?"
Paddington nodded, oblivious of the gathering storm clouds on Mr. Curry's brow. "He's written a testimonial saying how good they are," he continued eagerly. "I expect if you had a go every day, you could become an 8 stone weakling in no time at all. It's worth over £30, and if it doesn't work, you get your money back." Mr. Curry had been about to launch forth into a long tirade on the subject of bears in general, and the one living next door to him in particular, but he suddenly seemed to change his mind.
£30, he mused, "and you say there's a money-back guarantee?"
"Oh, yes, Mr. Curry," said Paddington earnestly. "I wouldn't have got them otherwise."
"In that case," said Mr. Curry briskly, "they certainly need a proper trial. I suggest you use the wall in my box room."
Paddington looked at Mr. Curry rather doubtfully. "I think I would sooner use one of Mr. Brown's walls, if you don't mind," he began.
"Nonsense, Bear!"
he snorted Mr. Curry, and to avoid any further argument, he reached over the fence in order to assist Paddington over.
"I shall test them myself," he announced grimly, "and if they don't work, I shall lodge a complaint with the manufacturers. Don't you worry, I'll make sure we get our money back."
"Our money, Mr. Curry?" said Paddington. "But—" Mr. Curry held up his hand.
"Don't say another word, Bear," he exclaimed. "Fair's fair. I shall have to deduct the cost of making good the damage you did the other day in my dining room, of course, but I see no reason why you shouldn't receive a small percentage as well, if there's any left over."
Paddington began to look more and more unhappy as he carried his belongings into the house and followed Mr. Curry up the stairs leading to his box room. The Brown's neighbour had a way of twisting words so that even the most outrageous things sounded perfectly reasonable. All the same, he knew better than to argue for fear of making an already bad situation even worse, and he watched carefully while Mr. Curry cleared a space and demonstrated exactly where he wanted the apparatus fixed.
"If you make a good job of it, Bear," he growled, "I may not report our little upset just now. I shall be out for a while doing my shopping. I have to go to the chemist to get some ointment for my nose. You can have it ready for me to test when I get back." Mr. Curry took a deep breath and pounded on his chest. "There's nothing like a spot of limbering up before the real thing." Whatever else he might have said was lost in a burst of coughing as he staggered out of the room and disappeared down the stairs. A moment later, there was a loud bang from the direction of his front door, and all was quiet again. Heaving a deep sigh, Paddington turned his attention to the matter in hand. He wasn't at all keen on doing jobs for the Browns' neighbour, for they had a nasty habit of going wrong, and it was with a distinct lack of enthusiasm that he picked up Mr. Brown's drill and set to work on the first hall. Paddington had drilled holes in walls on several previous occasions, and he'd always found it much harder than it looked when other people were doing it. But for once he had a pleasant surprise. Either Mr. Curry's plaster was unusually soft, or Mr. Brown's drill was extra sharp, for it went into the wall like a knife through butter, and in no time at all he had 4 neat round holes ready to take the plugs for the screws. However, if Paddington had learnt one lesson in life, it was that there was a reason for everything, and it was when he pushed a plug into the first hole he discovered why it had been so easy. Mr. Curry's box room wall wasn't made of brick at all, but some kind of soft plasterboard. No matter how many plugs he pushed through the hole, they simply disappeared from view, falling down behind as if some bottomless pit. Mr. Brown's box of plugs was a big one, but even so it was only a matter of moments before it was completely empty. Paddington surveyed the scene with growing dismay. After Mr. Curry's dire warnings, there was only one thing he could picture which would be worse than making a poor job of fixing the springs to the wall, and that was leaving 4 unfilled holes instead. As a last resort, he tried using some extra long screws in the hope they'd go right through to the other side. But as he contemplated the drunken way the apparatus was hanging, he had to admit at long last he was beaten. Paddington took another look inside the box. Considering the number of different walls Mr. Stalwart seemed to use for his equipment, he felt sure he must have come up against the same problem at some time in his life, and, sure enough, attached to the inside of the lid was a small packet he hadn't noticed before, and which had been there to deal with just such a situation. When he opened the packet, 4 screws fell out, and each had spring-loaded side pieces, specially made to pop out behind hollow walls as soon as they reached the other side. It needed only a few seconds' work with a screwdriver, and the plate was safely in place. It was only just the nick of time, for as he was putting the finishing touches to the last screw, he heard the front door bang, and Mr. Curry's footsteps began to draw near. As he entered the room, he eyed Paddington's handiwork approvingly. "Very good, Bear," he exclaimed, removing his coat. "Stand well back. I'll show you just how it should be done before I get in touch with the manufacturers." Rubbing his hands together, Mr. Curry picked up the handles, closed his eyes, and gave the springs a sharp tug. If he didn't actually look like Grant Stalwart, it wasn't for want of trying. With his lips tightly compressed, he struggled to gain a foothold on the linoleum. Paddington did as he was told and stood well back, for he had no wish to be in the way if his screws did come out. But Mr. Stalwart's special expanding screws were more than equal to the task. The plate was firmly fixed. "I think, Mr. Curry," he announced, "that the wall may come away before my springs do." In the past, Paddington had often noticed that many a true word was spoken in jest, but even so, he was even less prepared than Mr. Curry for what happened next. The words had hardly left his mouth when there was a splintering noise, and the Brown's neighbour suddenly shot past, taking with him a sizable part of the wall as well. He disappeared through the open doorway like a bullet from a gun. In the silence that followed, there was a sound not unlike dried peas raining down as Mr. Brown's plugs fell through the gap in the wall and rolled across the floor. But Paddington was oblivious to them. It did the only thing possible under the circumstances. Hurrying across the room, he hastily locked the door before Mr. Curry had time to recover. Then he sat down on his box and gloomily contemplated the hole in the wall while he waited for the storm to break. Mr. Curry held out a sheet of typewritten paper. "Sign here, Bear," he growled. Paddington looked round at the Browns for guidance, and then, at a nod from Mrs. Bird, he picked up a pen and carefully wrote down his name, adding his special paw mark for good measure, in order to show it was genuine. "Good," said Mr. Curry. "I hope this will teach you a lesson, Bear. This piece of paper," he reminded his audience, "makes over all rights in the apparatus to me. That means," he continued, "that any money due back under the guarantee will now come straight to me. I had intended he said meaningly for the Browns' benefit, to share the proceeds, but in the circumstances I feel quite within my rights to keep it all. Good day. Mr. Brown looked from one to the other as Mr. Curry left the house. He'd come back from his office rather late in the proceedings, and so far had only received a garbled version of all that had taken place. "You're not letting him get away with it, are you?" he said. "If you ask me, seeing how he more or less browbeat Paddington into lending him springs in the first place, it would serve him right if he lost the £30 and had to keep them." "£30?" echoed Mrs. Bird, with a twinkle in her eyes. "Who said anything about £30? Mrs. Brown held up a copy of her magazine and pointed to Grant Stalwart's advertisement. "They may be worth that much," she said, "after they've been paid for. But I'm afraid the £5 Paddington sent in was only a deposit. There are another 25 to go." Paddington nearly fell off his chair with surprise. "I've got another £25 to go!" he exclaimed in alarm. "No, dear," said Mrs. Brown. "You haven't, but Mr. Curry has." As the full meaning of the situation sank in, Mr. Brown began to chuckle. Then he felt in his wallet and took out a £5 note. "I think," he said, "that Paddington ought to have his deposit back. It's worth every penny just to see the right triumph of it wrong for a change." "Thank you very much, Mr. Brown," said Paddington gratefully.
"You should be careful how you spend it this time," said Mrs. Bird, "and always read the small print at the bottom of any advertisements."
Paddington locked the note away in his suitcase and then put the key inside his hat for safety.
"Oh, I shall, Mrs. Bird," he said earnestly. "Perhaps," he added, as he considered the matter, "I should buy myself a magnifying glass just to make sure." He reached out in order to help himself to some much-needed toast and marmalade, and as he did so, he caught sight of his reflection on the side of the teapot. "And if I have any change," he added thoughtfully, "I may buy some nutcrackers. I don't think my muscles will ever be big enough to manage your Christmas walnuts.